The San Pedro River was running higher than a man's waist that spring, swollen with snowmelt tumbling down from the White Mountains. It wound its way through the Arizona territory like a silver ribbon laid across the earth, whispering secrets to the willows that bent low to listen. The land was wild still, no telegraph lines yet, no railroad whistle slicing the quiet, just the rustle of mesquite, the cry of a hawk, and the far-off thunder of hooves belonging to a man who rode alone. His name was Taza, of the Chiricahua Apache. He rode a roan pony with a hide like burnished copper and a mane that caught the sunlight. He carried no rifle, only a short bow and a knife bound to his thigh with rawhide. The sun had browned his skin deep, and the lines at his eyes spoke of a man who had seen too much sky, too much death, and not enough peace. Taza was not running, but he was not staying either. The world he'd known, his people's world, was shrinking like water in a dry creek bed. Soldiers hunted them now. Ranchers fenced the land that once stretched endless. So he rode quietly, keeping to the river where the tracks of men disappeared quickly in the mud. He had no destination, only motion, only the wind. Then through that calm hum of nature came a sound that did not belong. A scream. It carried over the rush of the river. A woman's scream, high and sharp, ending in a choking gasp. Taza's pony flinched, nostrils wide. Without hesitation, he kicked the animal into motion, galloping toward the sound. Branches tore at his clothes, but he didn't slow. There, in the heart of the current, he saw her. A white woman, no more than 20 summers, her dress heavy with water, her bonnet spinning away downstream. She was fighting the river, thrashing like a trapped bird and losing fast. Her horse was gone, maybe spooked, maybe drowned, and she had only seconds before the river swallowed her whole. Taza threw himself from the saddle, boots and all, and dove into the current. The cold hit him like a knife. The river pulled at his legs, spinning him, slamming him into a submerged log, but he kept his eyes locked on the woman. Her pale hands reached once, then vanished beneath the foam. He dove. The water muffled the world to silence. Then her hair, golden in the murk, drifting like a sunbeam caught under water. He caught her by the waist, kicking hard, lungs burning, dragging them both toward the surface. When they broke through, she coughed and gasped, choking on air and fear alike. "Hold," he said in broken English, his voice deep and calm despite the chaos. "Hold to me." She clung to him as he fought the current, each stroke carrying them closer to the bank. Twice the river nearly took them back, but Taza would not yield. With a final heave, he drove his feet into the muddy shallows and lifted her onto the sand. The woman collapsed, coughing water and sobbing between breaths. Her hair lay plastered across her face, her skin ghost white except for the red flush at her cheeks. Taza knelt beside her, checking her breath, then stepped back as her eyes fluttered open. They were blue, clear, wide, and frightened. "Wait, where am I?" She gasped. "Safe," he said simply, though he wasn't sure that was true for either of them. She blinked, confusion and fear mingling as she took in his dark hair, his copper skin, the faint white scars along his arms. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Then she whispered, "You're Apache." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he stood and offered her his hand. She hesitated, then took it. He pulled her gently to her feet. Her dress clung to her, heavy and soaked, and she shivered in the breeze. Taza led her to where his horse waited, the animal's eyes wary but calm. He motioned toward the saddle. "Home?" she nodded weakly. "My father's ranch. Just south, by the cottonwoods." Taza looked that way. The wide plains and low hills where white men's fences stretched like scars across the earth. He'd passed that way before. He knew what they called men like him there, but he didn't hesitate. He lifted her onto his horse and walked beside it, guiding the animal along the narrow trail through the trees. They didn't speak much. She stole glances at him, curiosity mingling with gratitude. There was something quiet about him, something noble and ancient like a wolf that had seen too many winters. When they reached the edge of her father's land, she motioned for him to stop. "This is far enough," she said softly. They'll shoot if they see you." Taza nodded once, his expression unreadable. "I owe you my life," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, what's your name?" He paused as though weighing the worth of words. "Taza," he said finally. She smiled faintly, brushing wet hair from her eyes. I'm Clara Weston." For a moment they stood in silence, the sound of the river behind them and the sun dipping low over the mesa. Then Clara reached for her neck and unclasped a small silver cross hanging from a thin chain. She offered it to him. "Please take it. To remember that I'm grateful." Taza shook his head. "You keep," he said. Her hand lingered in the air, the charm glinting between them. "Then at least remember my name." He gave the faintest nod. "I will." Then, with the quiet grace of a spirit fading into legend, Taza turned his horse and vanished among the trees. Clara watched until he was gone, her heart heavy with a strange ache she couldn't name. That night, she dreamed of dark eyes watching from the shadows, and of strong hands pulling her from the jaws of death. She told no one. Her father would never understand, and her neighbors would call it scandal. But deep down she knew something had changed forever. Somewhere upriver, under a blanket of stars, Taza sat by his campfire. He held a small piece of her torn dress that had caught on his arm in the current. He turned it in his fingers, listening to the night sounds, the coyotes calling, the river whispering its endless song. He had saved her life. But somehow, in doing so, she had awakened something in his that had long been buried beneath sorrow and solitude. The San Pedro flowed on, carrying secrets and promises both while far off. The first hint of dawn touched the rim of the desert sky, and so began the story of the lone Apache warrior and the woman the river tried to claim, but could not keep. The Arizona sun rose hot and bright the next morning, baking the wet fields of the Weston Ranch until the earth steamed like breath from a tired horse. The land stretched wide, cottonwoods marking the river's bend, dust swirling in the distance and cattle moving slow under the sky's great weight. Inside the big white ranch house, Clara Weston sat at the window, a cup of coffee gone cold in her hand. She couldn't keep her mind from the river. All night she'd dreamed of him, of dark eyes beneath a brow weathered by wind, of a strong arm pulling her from the current. Taza, he'd said his name was. Just that, no surname, no need for one. A name like the whisper of wind over stone. Her father, Jed Weston, had been quick to notice her distraction at breakfast. Jed was a man carved from the same hard wood as the frontier itself. Broad-shouldered, white-bearded, with hands that had driven fence posts and buried kin both. He'd fought Comanche raids and Apache bands, seen his neighbors burned out of their homes. To him, an Apache wasn't a man. It was a warning. "You're sure it was just the river that near took you, girl?" he'd asked, eyes narrow as he buttered a biscuit. "Yes, Pa," she'd lied, forcing a smile. "Horse spooked, I went in. I was lucky, that's all," he'd grunted. "Best not ride alone again. Ain't safe, not with what's out there." She nodded. But her heart was elsewhere, upriver, where a man named Taza might still be traveling through the trees, unseen but near. For 3 days, Clara tried to bury her thoughts in chores. She milked the cows, mended harness leather, and helped her father's foreman count the herd. But no amount of work could quiet the pull she felt toward the river. It wasn't just gratitude, though that burned bright enough. It was something deeper, something she didn't have words for. On the 4th afternoon, when the wind carried the scent of rain and the cicadas droned low, she saddled her mare and slipped away while her father napped. She followed the river south, her heart hammering harder with every step. When she reached the place where she'd nearly drowned, she dismounted and waited. The air was still except for the whisper of reeds. "Taza?" she called softly. Her voice carried on the wind. Nothing answered but the river. She waited an hour, then 2, the sun sliding low. Just as she was about to leave, a faint rustle came from the willows. She turned sharply, hand to her chest. He stood there, silent as a shadow. His buckskin shirt was damp with sweat, his bow slung across his back. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the rescued and the rescuer, 2 people from worlds that weren't meant to meet. "You came back," she breathed. "You call," he said simply. She smiled despite herself. "I wanted to thank you properly. You saved my life," he shrugged slightly. "River tried to take. I pulled you free. That is all," but she shook her head. "No, it's not all. If you hadn't been there, I'd be gone, and I—" She hesitated, then reached into her saddlebag. "Please, take this." It was a silver locket shaped like a heart, its surface engraved with flowers. She opened it to show the tiny portrait inside, a younger Clara with her mother painted before illness had taken the older woman. "It was my mother's," she said softly. I want you to have it, Taza frowned. This is not mine to keep. Please, she insisted, pressing it into his palm. You saved me. Let me remember that someone still has kindness in this world. He closed his hand around it, feeling its warmth from her touch. Kindness is not what your people call us, he said quietly. Her smile faded. No, she admitted, but my father's stories aren't yours. They stood in silence, the air heavy between them. Then she asked, Where will you go? He glanced north. There is land where my people still live free. For a while, Clara bit her lip. You don't have to run forever. Taza met her eyes. For my people, forever already began. Something in those words struck her heart. She wanted to say more, to tell him she didn't believe in the hate that burned between their worlds. But before she could, a hawk screamed overhead. Taza looked up sharply, instinct alive in him. You must go, he said suddenly. Others may follow you. Not safe for me. She nodded, understanding too well. Will I see you again? He hesitated, then gave a slow nod. If River still runs, maybe. And then he was gone, fading into the trees, as though the land itself had swallowed him. Clara rode home under a sky painted in fire and purple. She kept her secret locked behind her lips, but her heart was restless. That night she took out a piece of paper and tried to sketch the memory of his face, the high cheekbones, the quiet eyes. But she couldn't capture it. The image wasn't just a face. It was a feeling, something that lived in the silence between heartbeats. Her father noticed her quietness again. You've been spooked since that river fall, he said one evening. If there's something wrong, speak it. I'm fine, Pa. He studied her for a long moment. Fine girls don't stare at the horizon like they're waiting on ghosts. Clara only smiled faintly. Maybe I am. Jed Weston didn't press further, but in his heart he felt unease. The frontier had taught him that peace was a fragile thing, and the way his daughter looked toward the river these days, he feared what ghosts she might be calling. Meanwhile, Taza camped high in the hills, the silver locket heavy against his chest. He opened it only once, studying the tiny portrait inside by the light of his fire. The woman in the image smiled like she trusted the world. The living Clara had smiled that way too, at him. He didn't understand why he kept it. Maybe because it reminded him that kindness could cross even the deepest river. Maybe because, for the first time since his tribe had scattered, he felt seen. Yet he knew what danger her kindness carried. If her people knew she'd spoken with an Apache, they would call her tainted. If his own band knew, they might say he'd forgotten his blood. Between them lay a chasm wider than any river. Still, when the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and mesquite, he thought of her. Of the blue of her eyes, like the sky after a storm. 2 weeks passed before they saw each other again. It was late afternoon, the horizon glowing red. Clara was washing clothes by the river when she felt it. That quiet sense of being watched. She turned, and there he was, across the water, half hidden by reeds. Her breath caught. She smiled. This time he didn't vanish. He crossed the shallow slowly, his reflection rippling like a ghost in the current. You came back, she whispered. He nodded once. River still runs. And in that simple truth the world seemed to pause, the river, the wind, even time itself. They spoke little after that. Words weren't needed. They were two souls from different worlds meeting on a bridge that neither understood, but both longed to cross. As the sun sank behind the hills, Clara said softly, If forever already began for your people, maybe it can begin again. Here. Taza looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his eyes. Then he touched his chest where the silver locket hung and said quietly, Maybe. And when he left that night, Clara didn't feel sadness. She felt hope, the kind that burns bright even in the dark. The summer sun baked the land until even the lizards sought shade. Dust rose from the western ranch like smoke, drifting on the wind that never seemed to rest. Clara stood at the porch rail, her eyes tracing the horizon. Somewhere beyond those red hills and shimmering heat waves, she knew he was out there. Taza. 2 months had passed since the last time they met by the river, yet his memory lived in her every thought. She still felt the warmth of his hand when he helped her from the current, still heard his quiet voice saying, If river still runs, maybe. She had no doubt he would come again. But as the frontier always reminded her, peace never lingered long. Word began to spread through the nearby settlements, rumors of Apache sightings. A small ranch north of the San Pedro had lost 2 cattle, the hides found stripped for water skins. A mail coach had been found abandoned, arrows in its frame. Folks whispered of war returning to the territory, and once again, fear became the common language of the West. Jed Weston, hardened by years of border trouble, didn't wait for proof. He called a meeting of ranchers at his barn, a rough circle of men with rifles and whiskey breath, each certain he knew what justice meant. "It's startin' again," Jed said grimly, his voice carrying through the dust-choked air. "You all remember 78 when they burned the Matheson place. We ain't letting that happen again." There were nods, curses, the sound of metal clicking as men checked their guns. "They come near my range," said one. "I'll hang the first one I catch." "Or shoot him," another growled. Clara stood just outside listening, every word cut like a blade. These men didn't know Taza, didn't know the strength in his silence, the calm honor in his eyes. To them, Apache meant thief, killer, savage. When the meeting broke up, she slipped back into the house, her stomach knotted with dread. That night, she lay awake, listening to the wind scrape against the window pane like ghostly fingers. Somewhere out there, he was alone, and now they were hunting his kind. A few days later, Clara found her chance. Her father was away checking fence lines near the southern ridge. She saddled her mare before dawn, heart pounding as she rode toward the river, toward the only place she knew he might still be. The morning mist clung to the water, soft and white as breath. She dismounted and walked quietly along the bank, calling his name. "Taza?" For a while, there was nothing but birdsong. Then came a rustle from the far side, a shadow among the trees. "Taza?" she whispered again. And he stepped into view. He looked thinner than before, his clothes worn, his hair tied back with a strip of hide. His bow was slung across his shoulder, his face streaked with dust. "You should not be here," he said quietly. "They're saying your people are raiding again," she told him. "They're gathering men, planning to ride. They think you're one of them." He studied her, his jaw tightening. "I am Apache." "To them that is enough." "No," she cried softly. "Not like that. You saved me. You've done nothing wrong." "Does not matter," he said, eyes narrowing toward the south. "When white men want war, they find reason." Her heart broke at the truth in his words. "You could come with me," she whispered. "Hide at the ranch just until this passes." He shook his head. "If they find me there, they kill your father too." She stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. "Then what will you do?" He looked up at the sky where vultures circled high. "Survive. Like my people always do." They met in secret for several days after that, each time hidden deeper along the river. Their conversations grew longer, their silences heavier. Clara began to understand the grief he carried, the broken promises of treaties. The homes burned, the children taken. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mesas, she told him, "If you ever have to leave, tell me. Don't just vanish." He gave her a long look. "Would you follow?" She didn't answer with words. She reached for his hand. For a moment, their fingers intertwined, the quiet air between them alive with something dangerous and beautiful. Then came a sharp crack in the distance, a rifle shot echoing off the cliffs. Taza dropped low, instincts flaring. "Go," he hissed, "now!" She froze, terrified. "Go," he repeated, already drawing his bow. Clara scrambled toward her horse just as a voice rang from the hills. "There!" By the river. Ranch hands. Her father's men. They'd followed her. Gunfire split the silence. Bullets kicked up dust near the bank. Taza moved like lightning, loosing 2 arrows. One shattered a man's rifle stock, the other sank into a tree beside another rider's head, close enough to send him reeling. "Clara!" shouted her father, galloping down the slope, his rifle raised. "Get away from him." She turned in the saddle, screaming, "No! Don't shoot!" But Jed Weston's finger was already on the trigger. The shot cracked like thunder. Taza dove aside, the bullet grazing his shoulder. He hit the ground hard, rolled, and vanished into the willows. Clara's heart seized. She spurred her horse between her father and the trees, blocking his aim. "Stop," she cried. "He saved my life." Jed's face turned to stone. "You don't know what you're saying, girl." "I do," she shouted. "The day the river took me, he pulled me out." "He's not what you think." For a long, frozen moment, the only sound was the rush of the river and the pounding of their hearts. Jed's rifle wavered in his hands. Behind him, the ranch hands muttered uneasily. Finally, Jed lowered his weapon. "Get home," he said coldly. "Now." That night, Clara locked herself in her room and wept until dawn. Her father said nothing more about it, but the silence between them was colder than any words. When she could stand it no longer, she stole away again at sunrise, back to the river, where it had all happened. The ground still showed signs of the fight, hoofprints, broken reeds, and a single dark stain where blood had fallen. "Taza," she whispered into the trees. For a while there was only the wind. Then faintly came a rustle above the ridge. He emerged slowly, clutching his shoulder, pale from loss of blood. "You're hurt," she gasped, running to him. He managed a faint smile. "It is nothing." She tore a strip from her dress and pressed it to his wound, tears in her eyes. "My father didn't mean—" He stopped her with a look. He meant it. He only missed. Her hands trembled as she wrapped the cloth. "I won't let them hurt you." He caught her wrist gently. "And if they come again?" "Then they'll have to go through me," she said fiercely, surprising even herself. Taza looked at her for a long time, as if memorizing her face. Then he whispered, "You are brave, but brave hearts die fast in this land." "Then I'll die brave," she replied. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words. Somewhere in that silence their fates bound themselves together. When Clara returned home that evening, her father met her on the porch. He said nothing, but his eyes were full of something she'd never seen before. Fear. Not for himself, but for her. He knew now that his daughter's heart had crossed a line no man could erase. And somewhere out there, under the same rising moon, an Apache warrior bound his wound, thinking of the woman who had stood between him and death. The West was vast, cruel, and lawless, but now it held two souls who would rather defy it than forget each other. And trouble, Clara knew, had only just begun. The dawn after the gunfire broke soft and golden, but there was no peace in it. Smoke from a distant campfire drifted along the hills, and the air smelled of rain and gunpowder both. Taza sat against a fallen log, his wounded shoulder bound with a strip of cloth torn from Clara's dress. The pain throbbed like a heartbeat, but worse than the wound was the ache inside his chest, the knowledge that her own father had nearly killed him. He had known this would happen eventually. He had seen it in her eyes, that mix of hope and fear whenever they met. Love between his kind and hers was a fire no wind could hide forever, and now the prairie was already smelling the smoke. He had to leave. But each time he tried to convince himself, her voice echoed in his mind, soft and fierce at once. "Then they'll have to go through me." He smiled faintly. "Brave, foolish Clara." The sun climbed higher. Taza rose slowly, shouldered his bow, and began to make his way north through the scrub, careful not to leave tracks. He meant to put miles between himself and her father's land before sunset, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. That afternoon, Jed Weston rode out alone to the cottonwoods by the river. He hadn't slept since the shooting. His daughter's words kept ringing in his ears. "He saved my life." He'd seen enough death in his time to know the difference between good and evil. Yet all his life he'd been told that Apaches were devils, godless raiders who killed for blood and pride. And now, his own daughter claimed one had saved her. He found her there again at the riverbank, staring into the water. "Clara," he said quietly. She turned, startled, her face pale but resolute. "Pa, you lied to me," he said, her voice trembled. "I was afraid you'd kill him." Jed dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft mud. "And what was I supposed to do, girl? Let an Apache walk free on my land?" "He's not just an Apache," she shot back, tears welling. "He's a man. A good man. He saved me when he could have let me drown." Jed studied her, his jaw hardening. "And what else did he do, Clara?" She flinched at the cold suspicion in his tone. "Nothing shameful, if that's what you mean." He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "You don't understand, child. Folks don't see men like him as men. If word gets out, they'll come for both of you." "I don't care," she whispered. Jed looked at her, really looked. He saw her mother's spirit in her eyes, kind, stubborn, untamable. Finally, he dropped his gaze. "You think you can love him? After all that's happened between our peoples?" Clara hesitated only a moment. "I already do." For a long time, Jed said nothing. Then he nodded slowly, as if something heavy had broken inside him. "Then I reckon I'd better make sure no one kills him for it." That night, a storm rolled in from the mountains. Thunder growled across the plains as father and daughter rode out under a sky black as a kettle of tar. Jed had decided to find Taza before the men from the ranchers' meeting did. They found him in a shallow canyon north of the river, his fire little more than embers. When Taza rose to meet them, his hand instinctively went to his knife, but Jed lifted both palms in peace. "I ain't come to fight," he said. Taza's eyes narrowed, wary. "Then why come?" Jed's voice was rough but steady. "To keep my daughter from losing the only thing she seems to care about." For a moment, no one spoke. The rain began to fall, light, steady drops hissing in the fire. Clara slid from her saddle, her hair clinging to her face. She ran to Taza, relief breaking through her fear. "You're alive!" He gave her a faint smile. "Still am." Jed looked between them, shaking his head. "I don't understand it, but I ain't blind. You saved her life. I owe you for that, but if those men find you, they'll hang you from the nearest tree." "I can take care of myself," Taza said evenly. "Not against 20 rifles, you can't," Jed replied. "Army's been sweeping the river valley again. They ain't taking prisoners this time." Taza's face hardened. "Then I leave." Clara grabbed his hand. "No, please. There must be somewhere safe." He looked down at her fingers, clutching his, small and pale against his weathered skin. "There is no safe, Clara, only far." She bit her lip, tears streaking her cheeks with rain. "Then I'll come with you." Jed's head snapped up. "You will not, I will!" she cried. "I can't stay here, Pa. I'll never fit in this world again, not after knowing him." Jed stared at her for a long time. Lightning flared behind him, outlining his silhouette against the dark. He looked like some old mountain carved from sorrow. Finally, he turned to Taza. "You take her north, you're dead men both. You understand that?" "I know," Taza said quietly. Jed exhaled. "Then go tonight. Before the riders come, I'll send them the other way." "Pa," Clara began, but he raised a hand. "Don't thank me, girl. Just don't forget where you come from. And don't make me regret letting you go." Before dawn, they rode. The rain had stopped, but the world was gray and heavy with mist. Clara clung to Taza as his horse carried them north through the low hills. Every sound made her heart jump. The cry of a coyote, the crack of branches, but she felt safer in his arms than she ever had behind any wall. They reached the foothills of the Santa Catalinas by sunrise. There Taza stopped and dismounted. "This is where I leave you," he said softly. She blinked, stunned. "What? No, you said—" "If I go farther, the soldiers will find my trail. They will follow. You must go back, Clara." Tears filled her eyes. "Back to what? A life that doesn't mean anything without you?" He took her hands in his, rough and warm. "You are strong. Your heart is free." "That cannot live in my world." "Then I'll make it my world," she whispered fiercely. "Don't you see, Taza? I don't care what they think. I only care about you." He looked at her long and hard, his eyes glimmering in the new light. Then he leaned forward and kissed her, soft, hesitant but deep with everything neither of them could say aloud. When he drew back, his voice was a whisper. "If river still runs, maybe." And then he turned his horse toward the mountains, vanishing into the mist like a ghost of the old world. Clara stood alone, the wind tugging her hair, her heart breaking open. She watched until he was gone, until the land swallowed him whole. When she finally returned home days later, her father was waiting on the porch, his face weary but alive. The ranch hands had gone. The riders who came looking for the Apache had been sent south. "You did what you had to," he said quietly. "So did you," she answered. He nodded once. "Guess we both learned something about what a man really is, and what love can make a fool do." She smiled sadly. "Then I reckon we're both fools." He put a hand on her shoulder. "World's full of worse things to be." And though she said nothing more, Clara knew her life had changed forever. That night, she walked to the river under the moonlight. The water moved slow and silver, whispering secrets only she could understand. She knelt at the bank, touched the surface, and felt its chill. "If river still runs," she whispered, "I'll wait." The water carried her promise north through canyons and mountains, all the way to where a lone Apache warrior rode under the stars, clutching a silver locket that gleamed like hope in the dark. 5 years had passed since the night Clara Weston watched the mist swallow the only man she'd ever loved. The world had changed some, though not near enough for hearts like hers. The railroad had stretched its iron veins through the valley. New towns had sprung up where once there was only sagebrush and silence, and men in fine coats spoke of civilization as though it could be hammered into the earth with rails and nails. But for Clara, none of it mattered. She still lived on her father's ranch, tending horses and helping manage the land after he took sick. Jed Weston had grown old fast, his beard white as cotton, his eyes dim but still kind. He never spoke again of the Apache who saved his daughter's life. Some things didn't need talking about. Yet on quiet nights, when the wind carried the scent of mesquite and rain, Clara would walk down to the river and stand where it all began, the place where she nearly drowned, and where Taza had pulled her from death's grasp. The current still whispered, and she would still whisper back, "If river still runs, I'll wait." One such evening a storm was brewing again. The clouds hung low and purple, their bellies heavy with rain. Clara was closing the barn doors when she saw dust rising on the horizon, a single rider coming slow along the ridge. Her heart quickened. It wasn't unusual to see travelers, but something about the way the rider moved stirred something deep inside her. As he drew closer, she saw the long black hair, the dark buckskin coat, the familiar way he sat his horse, straight-backed. Proud and silent, the world seemed to stop. "Taza," she breathed. He reined in a few yards from her, his face half hidden beneath the brim of his hat. When he lifted it, she saw the same eyes she'd never forgotten, fierce and gentle all at once. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind carried the smell of rain and dust between them. Then Taza said, low and rough, "The river still runs." Her breath hitched. She took a step toward him, her heart pounding like a drum. "You came back?" He nodded once. "I said I would when it was time." Her eyes filled with tears. 5 years, Taza. "I counted every moon," he said simply. Then she was in his arms, and all the pain and waiting dissolved into that one long moment. The storm broke above them, lightning flashing over the hills as rain poured down, drenching them both, but neither cared. They had weathered worse storms than this. Later, in the dry warmth of the ranch house, Taza sat across from Jed Weston, who looked smaller than Clara remembered, thinner, frailer, but still sharp enough to see what had returned with the storm. The old man's voice was hoarse. "So the Apache's come back." Taza bowed his head slightly. "I come for her, not to take what's yours." Jed studied him for a long while, then slow as winter, he smiled. "Boy, you already took what's mine. Took her heart clean away 5 years ago. Ain't much left for me to give." Clara touched her father's arm. He waved her off gently. "Don't you paw me. I seen the way you've been walking around these years. Half in this world, half in some dream. Guess that dream just rode back to life." He coughed, leaned back in his chair, and fixed his gaze on Taza again. "You aim to stay, or you just passing through?" Taza's voice was steady. "I aim to stay, if there's a place for me." Jed's eyes softened. "Ain't up to me, son. It's up to her." Clara met Taza's gaze. There always was. In the months that followed, tongues wagged in the nearby towns. Folks whispered about the Apache who worked the Weston ranch and the woman who loved him. Some spat in the dust when they passed. Some turned their backs, but others, quietly, slowly, started to see what love looked like when it didn't ask permission. Taza never sought their approval. He fixed fences, broke horses, and rode with Clara across the hills like he'd been born for it. The land seemed to breathe easier when he was near, the cattle calmer, the nights quieter. Sometimes, when the day's work was done, Clara would sit with him by the river and listen to his stories of the old days, of mountains that sang and rivers that remembered, of battles fought and brothers lost. She'd rest her head against his shoulder and whisper, "Do you ever miss it? Your people?" He would look toward the horizon, eyes distant. "Always. But the river carries many things away, and sometimes it brings them back in a new shape." That winter, Jed Weston passed quietly in his sleep. The whole valley came to his burial, even those who'd never spoken kindly of the Westons before. Taza stood a little apart, his hat in his hands, his expression unreadable. Afterward, Clara stood beside him by the grave. "He came to respect you," she said softly. Taza nodded. "He was a man of honor. Like the river, he changed with time." She smiled faintly through her tears. "Maybe we all do." He took her hand in his. "Then we honor him by living." And so they did. Spring came like a breath of forgiveness. Wildflowers covered the plains again, and the river ran full and strong. One morning, Clara woke before dawn to find Taza standing outside looking east. "What is it?" she asked, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. He pointed toward the sunrise, where a thin column of smoke curled into the sky. "My people," he said. "They've come south. New treaties signed. Peace talks with the army." Her eyes widened. "Does that mean—" "It means I can go home," he said quietly. Then after a long pause, "If I choose to." Her heart trembled. "And will you?" He turned to her, the sunrise painting his face in gold and red. "My home is where the river runs." She smiled through tears, stepping into his arms. "Then you're already home." Years later, when folks told the story of Clara Weston and the Apache warrior, it changed with every telling. Some said he saved her twice, once from the river and once from the smallness of the world. Others claimed they disappeared into the mountains, living free where no one could touch them. But those who'd ridden past the Weston ranch swore they'd seen smoke curling from the chimney even years after. And 2 horses grazing by the riverbank at dusk. And if you stood quiet by that same river, when the moon was full and the world hushed around you, you could still hear laughter on the wind, a woman's voice and a man's, mingling with the rush of the water, because the river still ran, and so did their love.